So we're in workshop, and John has agreed to share with us some of his research on the subject of heat island effect, and should be interesting, especially in relationship to how it might relate to some of the work we review here.
That's the idea.
Awesome.
So for the audience, the regular meeting will start at 7:30.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
So I've been really interested in the heat island effect and how it might affect our future in climate change. For those not familiar with the phrase, cities tend to be much warmer than the surrounding countryside. They capture heat. The heat gets bottled up between buildings and reflected off asphalt and other impermeable surfaces. And so cities tend to be somewhere between 2 and 8 degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside. And that leads to a lot of problems. It's surprising to me, heat kills more Americans each year than all other weather-related effects. So you hear about tornadoes and hurricanes and all the rest of them, but heat kills more people every year by far and nobody has an absolute number on how many people it actually kills because it affects the heart and other sorts of issues that might end up on a death certificate. So heat also, hotter cities lead to more violence, more aggravation, more crime. And so as climate change and global warming gets worse, what happens in cities? As you can see from this graph, the closer the buildings are, more downtown, more impermeable surfaces, the higher the heat goes up. And so how do you bring that down or regulate it such that it isn't a incentive not to live in cities? Cities otherwise have a lot of environmental benefits. In fact, Doug Kelbaugh, who's written about these issues, and particularly climate resiliency in cities, calls cities the last best hope of our civilization. That's how much benefits come from living in cities from a climate perspective. So if you look at lower greenhouse gas production, much more efficient energy use because you have smaller, closer housing units, less water use, more transportation affordability. There's more options about how to get around so you don't have long commutes and running up your gas bill, which is important these days. And residents in cities live healthier and longer lives on average. And that surprises a lot of people, but urban living is actually much healthier and good for the planet on almost all measures except the heat island effect. And so the worry is that if the global trend towards urbanization all over the world has all sorts of benefits beyond the sort of physical stuff. There's higher education levels, more innovation comes out of cities, better health, as I said before. People who move to cities tend to have lower population rates, which is also good for the climate. The more people live in cities, the less nature is impacted in biodiversity and extinction levels of other species and the whole rest of it, agricultural protection. There's just a slew of reasons why if you're environmentally conscious, you should live in a centralized place. But the heat island effect, what Kelbaugh calls the thermal paradox, is all these good things for the climate come out of cities. But the heat island effect might be such, as temperatures warm more and more, that it chases people away from the cities and you lose all that climate benefit. People buy their house on an acre in the countryside because they can't stand the heat in the summer. So how do you fix that? So if you want the cities to survive, you want them to thrive, you want them to be the benefit they are in terms of climate mitigation, how do you mitigate the urban heat island effect? That's the question. So here's a map that I've shown before, I think, that shows greenhouse gases by location, by zip code, essentially. And so if you go down to Manhattan, 28.830 metric tons per year per household. If you go up to Beacon, it's 44.5. If you move out into Fishkill and more commutable areas, it's up in the 80s. So Beacon isn't perfect. It's not Manhattan, green Manhattan. But it is relatively good from a greenhouse perspective. But if you turn the tables and look at the temperature levels, the exact opposite is, as you'll see on that heat map. The one on the top is like from one of the hottest days ever recorded, 110 degrees, and you can see all over the city. This is Manhattan, New York City. There's hot spots everywhere. Generally speaking, you get hot spots between the major park systems and the waterfronts. Wherever there isn't good breezes and their lower scale buildings help with winds and the exchange of temperature and that sort of thing. And obviously the parks, Central Park and Prospect Park and all the major green systems in the city lower the ambient temperature around them to a certain degree. But even suburban areas, if you look at the thermal map of rooftops, they're creating their own heat. It's just mitigated by a lot of greenery around them, more greenery around them. So what do you do? So I've come up, not me, the research shows that there's 4 basic levels how you reduce the urban heat island effect. The first one, and the easiest and cheapest one, actually, the most cost-effective one, is to paint roofs white. There's a measurement called albedo that measures the amount of radiant energy that reflects off the surface of some surface and heads back out into space. That doesn't create heat, that reflected rays of the sun. And so if you just paint rooftops white, there's now other versions of colors that are just as reflective as pure white, because white gets dirty fast and you lose some of that. But even that, New York City has a Cool Cities program in which they've pumped a lot of incentives into people painting their flat roofs white. And they've painted something like 5 million square feet of rooftops white, and it's made a significant difference. And buck for buck, that's the cheapest thing to do, is just paint the roof white. That helps. Or put on light shingles or a tin roof as opposed to a, black asphalt shingles. And everybody should probably be doing that, whether you live in a city or not. But a lot of people don't like the looks of white roofs. It's kind of jarring and odd. So there's obviously other reasons, other ways of dealing with this that maybe aren't as efficient economically and in terms of reflective value, but have other values, like green roofs. So green roofs absorb more heat, but they, through the photosynthesis and transpiration process, they absorb that heat and use it for other things other than producing heat in the environment. They put out enough vapors and reflected heat that they are much better than your standard asphalt roof. Something like a quarter of the average city is rooftops, and something about a third of a city or more can be pavement. So you can see how much, if you have black asphalt and black rooftops, you're just asking for the absorption of heat, and that radiated heat just keeps coming up and coming up. So this is the goal, that every rooftop, certainly the flat ones where it's easier to do, should be either one of 4 things. They should be either green, they should be reflectable, and that's usually white paint or something the equivalent. They have modern treatment systems, but light colors. They should be usable by people, or they should be energy producing with solar panels. And then obviously, the best of both is to have more than one of those features, like you have a white roof with solar panels, or you have a green roof with solar panels, or you have a usable roof with greenery on it. Yes?
How does the criteria of a usable roof help reduce the impact of heat gain?
No, it usually doesn't, but it's just, the point being is that you shouldn't just let your roof be tar or asphalt, or something bland and having no use.
Therefore, a green roof makes the access and use of that type of space more attractive.
Generally speaking, people don't put terraces on roof without any greenery.
Yep.
So you tend, if you're gonna make it a usable roof, it becomes at least semi-productive in terms of greenery. And even a wood decking is better than a black asphalt membrane. So that's sort of the pitch is for a planning board is to, and I know we don't have anything in our code that requires anybody to do a green roof or a white colored roof, but you can suggest these things, you can.
What are the structural implications of doing a green roof, depending on how you, because you now have the weight of planters, you're adding.
Yeah, I mean, there's people who design green roofs, and they do cost more money than a regular membrane roof.
I'm talking about to retrofit it to an existing building, do you have to sometimes do structural upgrades, or no?
No, I don't think so. Unless, I don't think you would have to. You'd have to analyze it, and there are very lightweight aerated soils.
Yeah, so.
You have to do structural upgrades.
I'm
Well,
sure
it
it
depends
depends
on
on the
what you do.
situation, depends on what you're trying to plan up there.
Yeah.
There
But-
are companies that provide like flats of sedums in a lightweight soil that usually can be accommodated within the like normal. Normal roof loads in a roof. There are systems that you can buy, but they're not like they're they're sort of plain. If you go to the Beacon, the Clark Institute down by, right, there's a green roof on that, and it is also sedum, and it's meant to absorb the water. There's a lot of practical water retention aspects to it that are, and as well as the solar aspects. But if you want to have planting like trees,
Well, yeah, that's
Yeah.
a whole, but I think it's just something to keep in mind, that there are implications to some of these, if it's a retrofit of an existing building.
Just curious, do you know of municipalities who have adopted codified
Yes.
requirements around?
Yeah,
Yeah,
there have
so
been
there's-
cities.
There's significant model code for this?
I think you could, certainly, I've seen references to certain cities have requirements for either green roofs or white roofs.
Yeah.
in New York City, you have to use a green roof or a blue roof, which is a water retention system, or some sort of planted, or there are a couple different options, but you have to, in the solar is another option. And it's not come up to me exactly what it is, but
Yeah,
that's a requirement they have.
One of my clients has even gone so far, this is in New York City, as to establish bee colonies on their roof. And they make honey, and they
That's
brand
cool.
it.
that's cool. So that's something, right now the code gives an incentive group for green roofs in the central Main Street district.
code.
Yes, it allows them, it gives, you can have them up to the edge where other things have to be back from the edge. So there's some mild incentives and encouragements, but no requirement.
And I would say, do we distinguish between a green roof that brings incentives versus, plantings that are maybe more ornamental than they're actually functioning as a green roof?
Yeah, well, like I said, there's no requirement, so all we can do at this point is encourage. But they're permitted in the central Main Street district and I think the linkage district.
If we wanted to find criteria, like let's say an applicant said, well, we're interested in doing a green roof as part of an application, could we find criteria to say, well, we would consider X, Y, and Z, a fully functioning green roof, and so that, if you're offering that, it's not just a couple of planters, it's these things, that we can then verify or review via design and approve.
And we've been asking for it, and, 208 had a green roof put on, I think. I don't know if it's up there yet, but that was part of their approved site plan, 208 Main Street. And hopefully 364 will have some green elements. So we haven't had any luck with solar panels yet. But sooner or later.
Do you have a sense that there's an appetite for the council to consider? this
It's
kinda-
never been talked about
Yeah.
that I know of. But I don't think it's unheard of to bring it up. I mean, it could be something the planning board could recommend.
Yeah.
So that's the first strategy, is to deal with roofs. The second one is to plant trees everywhere and plant vegetation everywhere. Just make sure that you don't have exposed pavement for the most part. And so, a lot of cities have set tree cover goals, and 40% seems to be the, sort of aspiration. If you measure the tree cover by aerials, you get 40% tree cover.
Is that lower one the view of Durkins from the top of East Main?
Say again?
The lower photo?
Yep.
Yep.
So I was just showing that historically, there were trees on Main Street, not everywhere. You look at some postcards, there's almost nothing. This one, for some reason, the East End seemed to have a lot more trees than the West End. And even now, the East End tends to have more. But if you go to a certain section of Main Street, you may have trees along the street, but they're providing almost no shade or very little shade. Now, maybe over time, they'll grow up. But a lot of the species that have been planted have been smaller species that work with sidewalks better, but don't necessarily provide abundant shade. And the idea, I think, is to create canopy trees as much as possible so that you don't have exposed pavement. And there's other places like here around Fountain Square where you can't see a tree in sight, there's like nothing. So if you look at Beacon from the air, we have, it's a terrific location for a city because it's surrounded by natural and parkland on the east, over 3,000 acres of natural and parkland, of protected land on the east slopes. And you have the Hudson River on the west, which gives you that sort of breeze from the ocean to the mountains that tends to create it. And even the block system might be created. I have no idea if this is why they thought about it when they set out the block system in Beacon, but it runs from west to east on a bit of a, from northwest to southeast, which is the prevailing wind pattern coming off the river. So in theory, the winds tend to blow down the streets rather than being blocked by the buildings necessarily. Depends on how you camp the blocks, how good of wind patterns you have. And Beacon is set up, although Main Street has that curve on the end which sort of blocks it at the far end. But generally speaking, Beacon should be in good shape in terms of its general area. But if you look at it, obviously you can see the tree cover is intermittent at best in the city center. So the idea would be to take that and within the city grow a 40% and have that as a goal, put a certain amount of budget into it each year to plant trees, to save existing trees, to make them grow better, to care for them so they don't end up dying in 5 or 10 years, which a lot of street trees do.
Is there anything that we would have to change in terms of approvals and in terms of layouts of Main Street buildings versus sidewalk size, the size? If you want to have trees that are going to create shade and enough of a canopy, does that mean we need to be providing bigger setbacks from Main Street so that you can have larger areas for?
I have another solution. Trees in the parking lane.
And there's a traffic calming?
Yeah, it acts not only as a traffic calming, it's a better environment for the tree because you can create a deeper, bigger well without impacting the sidewalk or heaving the sidewalk from the roots. There's always that competition between trees and sidewalks, and one always hurts the other in the long run. So in some places, they've started to put the trees in the street. So instead of having street trees, you have trees in the street. And it breaks up the parking lane, acts as a better traffic calming element It's in front of the wires rather than under the wires, so you can plant bigger species, more canopy that can flow over the street better, because it is trimmed on the backside rather than across the top, which kills a tree in the long run. And there are precedents for this. You know, if you go down to Charleston, you see a lot of trees in the street down in the lower end of Charleston. I have a couple examples from Rhinebeck in which even today there's a tree in the street on one of the side streets. They just cut this one down, unfortunately. But historically, the trees used to be in the streets. They just were banned from traffic. So in order to make it easy for the cars, they've banished the trees to the sidewalks, which makes it difficult for the pedestrians, but who cares for them, right? So I'm not saying that this is going to work on Main Street and you have sewer and water pipes to deal with. That's sort of the main constraint, and snow plows, I'm sure that'll always come up when you deal with this. But even, right now, they put the new bump outs and curb extensions on Main Street. That makes it more difficult to plow, so they have to be a little careful so they can work around trees as well. Most of these things work on residential streets, but even in commercial streets in certain places, they have trees in the parking lane. And it's a way of really giving the trees room to grow.
We
And
just found all those extra parking spots, John.
well, not really, because, there's always a space between trees, and you have a 2-foot bumper.
So what you're saying is that you don't think it would have much of an impact on available parking?
No.
This
I think
concept.
you could work out the parking issue. I think the sewer and water pipes issue is probably a more
Yeah.
problematic thing.
Stormwater, sewer, gas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big infrastructure hits.
So usually these are designed as new streets rather than
Makes
retrofitted,
sense. Yeah.
but depending on where the pipes are.
In the city?
Broadway
Could be
in Newburgh used to have trees going down the middle of it.
I used to have a trolley down the middle. I'm not sure they ever had trees down the middle.
thought I
But they have had, I've proposed that for Route 9D, instead of having the two-way left turn lane, have trees down the middle and have turning pockets. But again, it's easier to put them in the middle than it is along the curb line, because that's where the pipes tend to be, generally speaking. Depends on the street. And now I think this is the last slide. So here's a parking lot on Henry Street, the way it is now, which has almost nothing in terms of shade, and has a lot of other issues. And so the Main Street Access Committee retrofitted this, and you ended up with 12 more parking spaces and dozens of more trees.
And trees.
And you can even provide what they call tree diamonds in the corners of parking spaces, so you create a tree every 4 to 6 spaces without affecting the parking count, because they act as a curb stop.
Train station uses that.
What's that?
Up in the north parking lot, the train station uses that.
Do they?
Yeah. They're very high, though. So
Yeah.
they're undesirable spaces. You run the risk of clipping your bumper. but-
Yeah. The newer ones tend to be actually very low and have breaks in them so that
Curb
they can
height.
be used for
Yeah.
stormwater. So they actually absorb water as opposed to repel water.
One of the things that I've noticed, Adams, when they built the Adams parking lot for the new Adams up down there on 9D, or on 9, they had swales in the medians between the parking, rather than having stops and a raised area, like a curb area. They actually depressed it so that all the water went into these long gravel-filled, deep gravel-filled, they're obviously water infiltration areas. And they looked really nice. They're safe because you can't, there's nothing to damage your car against.
Right.
And it seemed dirt cheap and attractive. So I was wondering if there's something like, things like that are like best practices for both environmental, water mitigation and groundwater improvement, that sort of thing, that you can do in these very large, we only have a few of these really large parking areas, but they're the sort of thing that generate a lot of rainwater, right? And that's pollution, all the bits that are coming off your car get into the creek and into the Hudson. And, we could use it as an example, I think, if we use those kind of best practices and demonstrated it and how well it worked or for other projects.
Yeah. Well, we're probably running, there was two other things, and I wasn't only going to mention, I didn't have any slides on them, in terms of addressing it. Fewer cars, fewer car trips, so cities are good at that, providing you transit and other options, because that creates a lot of waste heat. And the last one was passive energy systems, so you don't need as much air conditioning. So you have natural flow as opposed to relying on closed windows and air conditioning all the time, because that just recycles heat into the environment. So those are the four sort of techniques we have to deal with in order to combat this. And you can, through a combination of things, bring that temperature down where it's equivalent with the rural area, but you have to work on all four of them.
Yeah, my only other question on this, we don't have to go into it in detail, maybe just hold it over, is, you know, in aggregate, on a large scale, could this have some impact on the effects of global warming?
Yes.
That was easy. Thank you, John.
Okay.
Very interesting, and, yeah, be curious to see where your studies further take you, especially as it relates to how this might enter into the conversation in the city. Okay, so we'll move into our regular meeting.